Chess Club down the hallway and be introduced to our many events, programs, like this one, Cinema Lit Film Series. The Chess Club has ongoing tournaments and classes for chess, and the library has a host of book clubs, writers groups, and ongoing classes. And all of this is happening 365 days a year under one roof. So I hope that you'll take the tour, become a member, and become part of our ever-growing cultural family here at the Mechanics Institute. I just want to mention also that after our program, books will be for sale, and Joyce will be here to sign your books. In her latest novel, Hazards of Time Travel, the young protagonist is arrested, renamed, and sent into exile, actually teletransported to another time and place. The America portrayed in this book has a resemblance to today, except that everything, our democratic values and our technology, are strangely inverted to the extreme. But you, the reader, will have to discover why and how these worlds exist and how the exile navigates her present, her past, and her future with extraordinary consequences. Joyce Carol Oates is the recipient of the National Medal of Humanities, the National Book Critics Circle Ivan Sandrof Lifetime Achievement Award, the National Book Award, and the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Fiction, and has been several times nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. She has written some of the most enduring fiction of our time, including the bestsellers We Were the Mulvaneys and Blonde, which was nominated for the National Book Award, and the New York Times bestseller The Falls, which won the 2005 Prix Femina. Her most recent works include a book of American Martyrs and a gorgeous short story collection, Beautiful Days. She is the Roger S. Berlin Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University and is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1978. And she is currently teaching at UC Berkeley. So please welcome Joyce Carol Oates.
Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's such a special place. Really, really fascinating. The spiral staircase, unless I hallucinated that. It's most distinctive. Well, I was teaching all afternoon, and so I just left UC Berkeley at about 6:05, and I was on a flurry. And this morning I woke up very early, around 5 o'clock, because I was actually in Los Angeles. And yesterday I was at Malibu at the Civic Theater. I was the first person to give a presentation in their series after their terrible, tragic fires. So it was thought that this was like the introduction to a reintroduction of their civic life or their cultural life. And they were worried that nobody would show up, but some people actually did show up. And it's such a tragic and really heart-stopping situation. The novel that I'm going to be reading from and discussing tonight is so it's so unsettling. I mean, even though I wrote it myself. Sometimes if you're a writer, the research that you do and the emotions that you endure when you're writing certain passages is certainly very true for poets. Somehow the residue of that emotion is still embodied in the prose or in the poetry. So when you revisit it, you start remembering some of the thoughts that you had at the time, and it's almost like opening a packet of some noxious, sometimes some ether or some strange smells. So parts of my fiction through my whole life, if I open a book and just start reading a paragraph, I can kind of remember some of the context when I was writing it. This novel is called Hazards of Time Travel, and very few people, maybe one person in the room, but very few people know that the original title was Vicissitudes of Time Travel. I was working on this back in 2011, actually. And I always had the notes for vicissitudes of time travel would sort of be in my mind, and I would take notes on it and do a little writing the way one does, and little sketches and thoughts and so forth. Vicissitudes of time travel. The title made it all the way to the very end of the writing process, and of course when it went to my publisher and my editor and the marketing people especially, it's sort of like a certain kind of net where everything gets through, but then vicissitudes, that was like too much. And they said, we have no idea what you're talking about, Joyce. What is this vicissitudes? We can't pronounce it. Is it English? What is it? So they said this is just will not do. And so I was hoping I could retain vicissitude. I can't even say it myself anymore. Vicissitudes of time travel, because there's something about that word. It's kind of a idiosyncratic word. It means some things that are going wrong, but in kind of a quaint way. Hazards of time travel has a different connotation. Hazards seems more like traffic or journeying. It seems like maybe a more common word somehow. However, if there is time travel, I'm sure that there are both vicissitudes and hazards of time travel. And I was working on this, as I said, back in 2011. I was working on a vision of a society that I didn't necessarily think of as dystopian or in any particular tradition of dystopia, but a future that seemed to me almost inevitable, like moving forward in a sort of trajectory as if through a tunnel, that we're in an increasing state of surveillance, and there are these eyes and different cameras following us all the time. I think it's in London, or maybe it's in all of England, but certainly in London, they say that you're never off a camera, like you're walking outside, there's always an eye, and they can splice together every part of where you're walking. And then we have recently learned that our cell phones are spying on us. Our close, intimate friends that we carry, next to our hearts and so forth, that at the same time they're picking up all this information about us, and who knows what they're doing with it. Maybe they're conspiring with one another somewhere. They're going to rise up against us, our cell phones, and all sorts of artificial intelligence, robots and drones and things like that. And in 2011, I had sort of invented small drones. That's what the funny thing about my novel. And then as the years went by, I thought, oh my goodness, all these things that I thought I was inventing, of course, they're just sort of coming true. And I thought I was so clever in one of the scenes in the novel that the reader would be really surprised by something that happens. But now I think the reader will just expect it, because it probably has happened to the reader, or he's witnessed things like that. So that's sort of a strange and maybe inevitable consequence of writing about phenomena that seem tied in with technological advances. Many writers write about life before cell phones and computers, because that's added such complexity to our human interactions. Just about every mystery that you've ever read, or detective movie that you've ever seen, be totally annihilated if people just had cell phones and they could figure out where one another are, and communicate with one another. Like that's about 97% of our culture just disappears if people just had their cell phones with them. That's supposed to be funny. People are just looking kind of blank, Well, the other evening I was actually at Claremont College before Malibu. I was sitting at a table with wonderful students at Claremont McKenna College, and it was a round table, and there were about 8 or 10 young people. So we were talking about satire and political caricature and cartoons and things like that. And I said, well, such a great artist is R. Crumb. Total blank. The faces were just completely blank. They were polite. I mean, they were being polite to me, sort of maybe embarrassed that I was talking about somebody that actually never heard of in a million years. And I had thought R. Crumb was sort of trendy, let's say, but no. So everything eventually becomes outdated, I suppose. So this novel I was working on in 2011, sort of anticipating a state where we would all be under surveillance and that we would be increasingly oppressed by a kind of conformity that in 2011 didn't seem that close. But since then, so much has happened, and now it's 2019, and unless somehow it's later than that. And global warming is so much more evident now than it had seemed at that time. And with the election, the campaign, which was so acrimonious and embittered of 2016, that was very like a battleground. And then the election of Trump, which was startling and tragic in some quarters, and unbelievable in other quarters, and ludicrous in still other quarters. But that sort of happened, and the novel now seems to be in a kind of zone of its own, because people ask me, well, we are writing about the Trump administration and subsequent to the election of 2016. I said, no, I actually had finished the novel before that. And if somebody had asked me kind of naively or casually, who do you think would be president next after Obama? I said, well, I would have said, well, maybe Hillary Clinton. It seemed like just a reasonable thing that one might say. So I wasn't really anticipating a United States in crisis, a constitutional crisis. I wasn't really anticipating that. And I'm not really thinking that what Trump represents, the sort of populist demagogue paralysis and both voter suppression and different sorts of things like that. I wasn't really anticipating a sort of populist triumph. It seemed to me more likely to be a government that was totalitarian in the sense of being really total, that you were controlled not by popular faces or people who are actually trying to persuade you, and not by people who are eccentric or funny or clownish or satirical. And there may be some people running in a primary, but you don't know what they look like. They're just these little symbols, smiley faces or little images that you're just sort of voting for nothing. You have no idea who the people are. Maybe it's a corporation, maybe it's a committee. It's probably not one man, it's probably not one person, but it's probably something like a global international corporation that's running everything. And the idea of cities and states and countries is maybe outmoded. So this is sometime in the future. It's not maybe too far in the future. The first chapter I'm going to read just parts of. It's called Good News. I should say my character, Adrienne Stroll, she is a representative young woman. She's actually a girl. She's 17 at the start of the novel. She becomes 18 in the course of the novel. She does grow up a little bit, and by the end of the novel, she's changed a bit from what she is in the beginning. I wanted to have a very plain style that was not laden or distracting with metaphors or similes. It's, George Orwell spoke of the ideal prose style for English. Basically, there are two kinds of prose style, and I'm sure there are writers in the room. That one prose style is that your prose is transparent like a window. It's like a window pane. George Orwell thought that was the ideal prose for English, for fiction. So that there's something outside the window, you're looking through it, and the prose is a way of showing you what's there. In contrast to that, and of course it's really a spectrum, we have very ornate language like Nabokov, who is very much a stylist. And to read Nabokov is to be taken very far away from any kind of transparent window, so that what you're looking at is not action outside there so much as you're admiring the acrobatics of language. What I chose for this novel is that plain style, which would be appropriate for a young woman or girl who is intelligent but not intellectual, and she herself is not a writer. Good news, or so at first it seemed. I'd been named valedictorian of my class at Pennsboro High School, and I'd been the only one of our school of 5 students nominated to be awarded a federally funded Patriot Democracy Scholarship. My mother came running to hug me and congratulate me, and my father, though more warily. "That's our girl. We're so proud of you." The principal of our high school had telephoned my parents with the good news. It was rare for the phone to ring in our house, for most messages came electronically, and there was no choice about receiving them. And my brother Roderick came to greet me with a strange expression on his face. He'd heard of Patriot Democracy scholarships, Roddy said, but had never known anyone who'd gotten one. When he'd been at the high school, he was sure that no one had ever been named a Patriot Scholar. "Oh, well, congratulations, Addie." "Thanks, I guess." Roddy, who'd graduated from Pennsboro High 3 years before and was now working as a barely paid intern in the Pennsboro branch of NAS Media Dissemination Bureau, was grudgingly admiring. I thought, he's jealous. He can't go to a real university. Somehow, without realizing over a period of years, I'd acquired a reputation among my teachers and classmates for saying surprising things, unexpected things that other students would not have said. Impulsively, I'd raise my hand and ask questions. I was not doubtful exactly, just curious and wanting to know. For instance, was a science fact always and inevitably a fact? Did water always boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit? Or did it depend upon how pure the water was? And were boy students always smarter than girl students, judging from actual tests and grades in our school? Some of our teachers, male, made jokes about me so that the class laughed at my silly queries. Other female teachers were annoyed and maybe frightened. My voice was usually quiet and courteous, but I might have come across as willful. Sometimes the quizzical look on my face disconcerted my teachers, who took care always to compose their expressions when they stood in front of a classroom. There were approved ways of showing interest, surprise, or mild disapproval, severity. Our classrooms, like all public spaces and many private spaces, were, quote, monitored for quality assurance. But adults were more keenly aware of surveillance than teenagers. Each class had its spies. We didn't know who they were, of course. It was said that if you thought you knew, you were surely mistaken, since Democratic Citizens Volunteer Surveillance Bureau chose spies so carefully, it was analogous to the camouflage wings of a certain species of moth that blends in seamlessly with the bark of a certain tree. As Dad said, your teachers can't help it. They can't deviate from the curriculum. The ideal is lockstep, each teacher in each classroom performing like a robot and never deviating from script on the penalty of you know what. Oh, was this true? For years in our class, the class of NAS 23, there had been vague talk of a teacher, how long ago we didn't know, maybe in middle school, who deviated from the script one day, began talking wildly and laughing and shaking his or her fist at the eye. In fact, there were probably numerous eyes in the classroom, and all invisible, and was arrested and overnight deleted. So a new teacher was hired to take his or her place, and soon no one remembered the teacher who had been deleted. And after a while, we couldn't even remember clearly that one of our teachers had been deleted, or had there been more than one. Were certain classrooms in our school haunted? In our brains where the memory of X should have been, there was just blank. I was not aggressive in class, I don't think so, but compared to my mostly meek classmates, some of whom sat small in their desks, like partially folded up papier-mâché dolls, it's possible that Adrian Stowe stood out in an unfortunate way. In patriarch democracy history, for instance, I'd question the facts of history sometimes. I'd ask questions about the subject no one ever questioned, the great terrorist attacks of 9/11/01. But not in an arrogant way, really, just out of curiosity. I certainly didn't want to get any of my teachers in trouble with the EOB, Education Oversight Bureau, which could result in them being demoted or fired or vaporized. I thought that, well, people like me mostly. I was the spiky-haired girl with the big, glistening, dark brown eyes and a voice with a little catch in it and a habit of asking questions. Like a really young child with too much energy in kindergarten, you hope will run in circles and tire herself out. With a kind of naive obliviousness, I earned good grades, so it was assumed that despite my father being of a suspect caste, I would qualify for a federally mandated state democracy university. That is, I was eligible for admission to one of the massive state universities. At these, 1,000 students might attend a lecture, and many courses were online. Our restricted universities were far smaller, prestigious, and inaccessible to all but a fraction of the population. Though not listed online or any public directory, these universities were housed in traditional campuses in Cambridge, New Haven, Princeton, and so forth, in restricted districts. Not only did we not know precisely where these centers of learning were, we also had not ever met anyone with degrees from them. When in class I raised my hand to answer a teacher's question, I often did notice classmates glancing at me, my friends even, sort of uneasy and apprehensive. What will Adrian say now? What is wrong with Adrian? There was nothing wrong with me, I was sure. In fact, I was secretly proud of myself, maybe just a little vain, wanting to think, I am Eric Stroh's daughter. The next chapter is called The Arrest. The Arrest. The words were brisk and impersonal. Stroll, Adrian, hands behind your back. It happened so fast at graduation rehearsal. So fast I was so surprised, too scared to think of resisting. What was happening? I could not believe it. I was being arrested. My wrists were handcuffed behind my back. Within seconds, I was a captive of the Homeland Security. I'd only just given my valedictorian speech and stepped down from the podium to come down from the auditorium stage when there came our principal, Mr. Mackey, with a peculiar expression on his face, muted anger, righteousness, but fear also, to point at me, as if the arrested officers needed him to point me out. That's she, Adrian Stroll, that's the treasonous girl you seek. Mr. McKay's words were strangely stilted. He seemed very angry with me, but why? Because of my speech? But the speech had consisted entirely of questions, not answers or accusations. I'd known that Mr. McKay didn't like me. I didn't know me very well, but he knew of me from my teachers. It was shocking to see an adult's face, a look of genuine hatred. She was warned, they were all warned. We did our best to educate her as a patriot, but the girl is a born provocateur. Provocateur? I knew what the term meant, but I never heard such a charge before applied to me. Later, I would realize that the arrest warrant must have been drawn up for me before the rehearsal, of course. Mr. McKay and his faculty advisors must have reported me to youth disciplinary before they even heard my speech. They'd guessed it would be treasonous, and I wouldn't be allowed to give it at graduation ceremony. As others stood staring at the front of the brightly lighted auditorium, the arrest warrant was read to me by the female arresting officer. I was too stunned to hear most of it, only the accusing words: arrest, detention, reassignment, sentencing, treason speech, and questioning of authority. Quickly then, Mr. McKay called for an emergency assembly of the senior class. Murmuring and excited, my classmates settled into the auditorium. There were 322 students in the class, and like wildfire, news of my arrest had spread among them within minutes. Gravely, Mr. McKay announced from a podium that Adrian Stroll, formerly a valedictorian of the class, had been arrested by the state on charges of treason and questioning of authority. And what was required now was a vote of confidence from her peers regarding this action. That is, all members of the class, except Adrian Stroll, were to vote on whether to confirm the arrest or challenge it. Quote, we will ask for a show of hands, Mr. McKay said, voice quavering with the solemnity of the occasion, in a full, fair, and unbiased demonstration of democracy. At this time, I was positioned handcuffed with a wet, streaked, guilty face at the very edge of the stage, as if my classmates needed to be reminded who the arrestee was. Gripping my upper arms were two husky youth disciplinary officers from the Division of Homeland Security. They were one man and one woman. They wore dark blue uniforms and were equipped with billy clubs, tasers, mace, and revolvers in heavy holsters around their waists. My classmates stared wide-eyed, both intimidated and thrilled. An arrest at school and a show of hands vote, which was not exactly a novelty in itself, except on this exciting occasion. Boys and girls, attention, all those in favor of Rowdy and Stroll being stripped of the honor of class valedictorian as a consequence of having committed treason and questioning authority, raise your hands, yes? Oh, there was a brief, stunned pause. Hesitantly, a few hands were lifted, then a few more. No doubt the presence of the uniformed youth disciplinary officers glaring at them roused my classmates to action. Entire rows lifted their hands, yes. Here and there were individuals who shifted uneasily in their seats. They were not voting yet. I caught the eye of my friend Carla, whose face too appeared to be wet with tears. And there was Paige all but signaling to me, "I'm sorry, Adrian, I have no choice." As in a nightmare, at last a sea of hands were raised against me. As if there were some not voting, I could not see them. And all opposed? Mr. McKay's voice hovered dramatically, as if he were counting hands. In fact, not a single hand of all the rows of seniors were to be seen. I think then we have a stunning example of democracy in action, boys and girls. Majority rule. The truth is in the numbers. So she's taken away in a van to a place, a windowless place, and she's interrogated. And like all police interrogations, there's a lot of repetition. Who wrote the speech for you? No one. I said, no one wrote it. I wrote it myself. Did your father, Eric Stroh, write that speech for you? No, my father did not. Did your father tell you what to write, influence you? Are these questions your father's questions? No, my own questions. Did either of your parents help you write your speech, influence you? Are these questions their questions? No. Are these treasonous thoughts their thoughts? Oh, I was terrified that my father or both my parents had been arrested and would be interrogated too, somewhere in this awful place. My speech was examined line by line, word by word, by the interrogators. It was just two printed sheets of paper with a few scrawled annotation. My computer had been seized from my locker and was being examined as well. The interrogators were brisk and impersonal as machines. Almost you thought they might be robot interrogators until you saw one of them blink or swallow or glare at me in pity or disgust or scratch at his nose. Even then, as Dad might have said, the figures could have been robots, for the most recent AI devices were being programmed to emulate idiosyncratic, spontaneous human mannerisms. My valedictorian address had been timed to be no more than 8 minutes. That was a tradition at our school, a short address. My English teacher, Mrs. Dewson, had been assigned to advise me, but I hadn't shown her what I'd been writing. I hadn't showed Dad or Mom or any of my friends. I wanted to surprise them. After half dozen failed starts, I'd gotten desperate and had the bright idea of asking numbered questions, 12 in all, of the kind my classmates might have asked if they'd had the nerve. Some of the very questions I asked my teachers, who'd never given satisfactory answers, like, what came before the beginning of time? And what came before the great terrorist attacks of 9/11? Our RNAS calendar dates from that time of that attack, which was before my birth, but not my parents' births. And so my parents could remember a pre-NAS time when the calendar was different. Time wasn't measured in just a 2-digit figure, but 4-digit figure. Under the old, now outlawed calendar, my mother and father had been born in what had been called the 20th century. It was against the law to compute birth dates under the old calendar. Daddy had told me I had been born in what would have been called the 21st century if the calendar had not been reformed. NAS means North American states, more formally known as reconstituted North American states, which came into being some years after the great terrorist attacks as a direct consequence of the attacks, as we were taught. Following the attacks, there came a, quote, interlude of indecisiveness, during which time issues of rights, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, civil rights law, and so forth, versus the need for patriot vigilance in the war against terror were contested. with a victory after the suspension of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights by executive order for patriot vigilance. Yes, it's hard to comprehend. As soon as you come to the end of such a long sentence, you've forgotten the beginning. How strange it was that there'd been a time when the regions known as reconstituted Mexico and reconstituted Canada had been separate political entities, separate from the states. On a map, it seems clear, for instance, that the large state of Alaska should be connected with mainland United States and not separated from by what was formerly Canada. This too was hard to grasp but had never been clearly explained in any of our patriot democracy classes, perhaps because our teachers were not certain of the facts. The old, outdated, that is, unpatriotic history books had all been destroyed, my father said. Hunted down in the most remote outposts, obscure rural libraries in the Dakotas, below ground stacks in great university libraries, microfilm, and had once been the Library of Congress. Outdated, unpatriotic information was deleted from all computers and all accessible memory. Only reconstituted history and information were allowed, just as only the reconstituted calendar was allowed. Well, this is only logical, we were taught. There was no purpose in learning useless things that would only clutter our brains like debris stuff to overflowing in a trash bin. But there must have been a time, before the Reconstitution and before the attacks. That was what I was asking. Our history, which we'd had every year since 5th grade, was only concerned with post-terrorist events, mostly the relations of the NAS with its numerous terrorist enemies in other parts of the world, and an account of the triumphs of the NAS in numerous wars. So many wars. They were fought now at long distance and did not involve living soldiers for the most part. Robot missiles were employed, and powerful bombs said to be nuclear, chemical, and biological. In our senior year of high school, we were required to take a course called Wars of Freedom. These included long ago wars like a Revolutionary War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, more recent Afghanistan and Iraqi wars, all of which our country had won decisively. We were not required to learn the dates or causes of the wars, if there were causes, but battles and names of high-ranking generals and political leaders and presidents. These were provided in columns to be memorized for exam. The question of why was never asked, and so I asked it in class and in my valedictory address. It had not occurred to me that this was treason speech or that I was questioning authority. So she's interrogated, and she eventually is tortured to a degree. She's then put in something like an imaging machine. I suppose at that time I had thought it was really science fiction that you could image the brain and sort of see what was going on in the brain. I think now, I think right today you can't tell if people are lying, I think. It's past, maybe you can, but I'm not sure about that. It's one easy step, though, to be imaging the brain and seeing parts of the brain lighting up. It'd be a very easy step to determine whether a person was actually lying. So she's too upset, her brain is too agitated, and they can't get a good reading. So she's continually being tortured with loud, deafening sound. Who wrote your speech for you? Who influenced you? Who's your collaborator in treason? It was your brother Roderick who reported you. As a treason monger and a question of authority, you have been denounced by your brother. I began to cry harder. I had lost all hope. Of all the things the interrogators had told me and wanted me to believe, it was only this that Roddy had reported me. That seemed to be possible and not so surprising. I could remember how, squeezing my hand when he congratulated me about my good news, Roddy had smiled, his special smirking smile, just for me. Congratulations, Addie. So I'm sort of maybe running out of time. I'll just quickly go through. She's taken to another level of interrogation. I'll just read this little chapter. It's quite short. It's called Disciplinary Measure. Next morning, I was taken from my cell and returned to youth interrogation. Half carried from my cell, handcuffed and my ankles shackled, I was very tired, sick, and scarcely conscious. It was my hope that my parents would be waiting for me, that they'd been summoned to get me and take me home. I would accept it that I'd been forbidden to attend graduation or even to graduate from high school. I accepted I might be sent to a youth rehabilitation camp, as had been rumored boys at Pennsboro High had sometimes been, who'd been arrested by youth disciplinary. All I wanted was to see my parents, to rush at them and throw myself into their arms. Some months ago, my parents had celebrated my 17th birthday with me. It had been a happy time, but seemed now a lost childish time. I had not felt like 17, and now, desperate for my parents, I scarcely felt like a teenager at all. Of course, my parents were nowhere near. Probably they did not know what had happened to me, and I did not dare ask about it. Instead, I was being sternly informed several Patriot Scholars had been arrested yesterday afternoon, simultaneous with my arrest, in a youth disciplinary sweep. After a season or more of relatively few such sweeps and seizures, the Homeland Security was now cracking down on potential subversives. The Patriot Scholars were graduating seniors from other high schools in the area. Their names, too, had been handed over to Homeland Security by the principals of their schools. The question was, put bluntly to me, was I arguing a collaborator with these students? Was I a co-conspirator? Their names were told to me. I never heard of any one of them. Their faces appeared on 3 overhead screens, TV screens. I'd never seen any one of them before. A camera was turned on me in a blaze of blinding light. I'd assumed that my frightened face was being beamed to the other interrogation rooms where the arrested Patriot Scholars were being held. Repeatedly, I was asked, was I a collaborator with any one or more of these individuals? Was I a co-conspirator? All I could answer was no. And then these are the others. Chen Michael was a very young-looking Asian-American boy with sleek black hair worn to his collar and widened, very dark and alarmed eyes. He, too, had been named valedictorian of his graduating class at Roebuck High. A glance at Chen Michael, and you knew that this was a very smart boy. Perduer Lauren was a thick-bodied girl with a strong bone, ashen face, and damp eyes. She was sitting as upright as possible, though handcuffed and shackled at the ankles. She was a student at East Lawrence High. A glance at Peruta Lauren, and you knew this was a girl who thought for herself, and very likely in her classes, asked questions as I had. Zoel Joseph J., a tall, lanky, dark blonde boy with a blemished face, thick glasses, and a small mustache on his upper lip. He had been named salutatorian of his class at Rumsfeld High, and looked like a math computer whiz. One glance at Zoel Joseph J., and you knew here was a boy you wanted for your friend, whose kindness, patience, and computer expertise would be invaluable. The 4 of us on the TV monitors were not looking great. Our eyes were bloodshot, our mouths were trembling. Whatever we'd done, we regretted it. We didn't look innocent. We didn't any longer resemble high school seniors. We looked much younger. Just kids, scared kids, kids needing their mom and dad, kids without a clue what was happening to them. A panic thought came to me. What if one of the Patriot Scholars suddenly confessed to collaborating with the rest of us? Will we all be executed? A brisk voice informed us that we had 30 seconds to compose our confessions. At the end of those 30 seconds, if no one had confessed, one Patriot Scholar would be suitably disciplined with a domestic drone strike on camera. We were terrified, paralyzed. No one spoke. Sleek, black-haired Chen Michael opened his mouth and tried to speak, and no words came out. There were tears and agitation in Perduer Lauren's face, but no words issued from her mouth. Then I heard myself pleading in a thin, wavering voice that we were not collaborators. We didn't know one another. We'd never seen one another before. We'd never seen one another's names. Indifferently, the off-screen voice was counting, 11, 16, 21, 27, 28. My heart was pounding so violently I thought it would burst. My eyes darted from one TV monitor to the others. as the Patriot Scholars trembled and cringed in their chairs, narrowing their eyes, yet unable to shut their eyes entirely. On one of the screens, there was a blinding flash. The boy with the mustache on his upper lip, Zoel Joseph J., was slammed sideways as if he'd been struck with a laser ray that entered the side of his head like liquid fire, exploded and devoured his head and then his torso and lower body in less than 3 seconds. What was left of Zoel Joseph J. fell to the floor, slithered and phosphorescent, and by quick degrees this too vanished. I had a glimpse of the other Patriot Scholars staring in horror at the TV screens before all 4 screens went dark, and a roar in my ears became deafening. When I awoke from a sick, dead faint, I was being lifted from my chair, yet so terrified still, I didn't dare to open my eyes. She is then taken to another place, and she's going to be sent to exile. She's not going to be annihilated or vaporized. So she goes to Zone 9, which is the happy place, and this is, for some obscure reason, a rural university area in Wisconsin in the very late 1950s. It did happen that I was in Wisconsin at that time. A little later than that, was actually not 1959, I don't think. As people have asked me why I've chosen to send this poor girl, her punishment is to go back in time. Most time travel novels take us into the future. Some of the very greatest novels like H.G. Wells take us quite far into the future. It's unusual to go into the past. So I will stop my formal reading and just say sort of generally that the novel takes us into this other world, and most of the novel is in this other world. I wanted an ontological dislocation in much of my writing, even my realistic writing, so that there is a sense of the physical or visceral reality that one is in, being dislocated a little. If I write about a place I know, I don't think James Joyce did this with Dublin, but if I write about a place that I know very well, I will always insert something a little different that's not exactly real, but surreal, because I would like to make that claim for it. So too with fiction. So my novel has 2 quotes. One of them is in the hardcover book, and one I'd written in hand in the galley here. The first quote is relevant to the world of people who are conditioned. We're all sort of brainwashed and conditioned to some extent in civilization, and our society very, very much, because we've been under this surveillance and all sorts of things have been beamed at us, like advertising, and for most of our lives. It's hard to break free of that. B.F. Skinner, the great psychologist of behavioralism, is quoted, quote, "A self is simply a device for representing a fundamentally unified system of responses." That's classic behavioralism. A self is simply a device for representing a fundamentally unified system of responses. That's Skinner from his great classic Science and Human Behavior. Before him was John Watson, whose experiment some of you probably know if you took Introduction to Psychology. John Watson's considered the father of American psychology or behaviorism. You've all seen the film of little Albert, this really adorable little infant. He's about 9 months old, and he's subject to this experiment. He touches a white rat. There's a dog and a monkey and a person and the white rat. And then as he touches the white rat, John Watts is standing behind him, pounding away with some hammer, and terrifies the little infant, who starts crying. It's classic Pavlovian conditioning. So the next time, like a month later, he's brought back. This little baby had actually liked the animals. He wasn't afraid of any of them. He was petting the white rat, and this cute little baby, little Albert, he was enjoying what he didn't know was an experiment. But then a month later, the little baby's brought back, and the little baby is already kind of hunched over and kind of grim, and he's not smiling anymore. He sort of anticipates something awful. And then these animals are brought back, and the white rat is brought back, and he's terrified. He sees the white rat, and he starts screaming and crying. And again, just seeing the white rat, John Watson standing behind him, pounding away, doing what, I can imagine what damage is done to the neurons in an infant brain with all this really deafening noise. So the little baby actually tries to crawl and would fall on the floor, but they kind of grab him, bring him back. Classic conditioning, and very interesting because John Watson sort of made his career with that. Because from that point onward, little Albert was afraid not only of the white rat, he was afraid of the monkey, he was afraid of the dog, he was afraid of the person, he was even afraid of a fur coat. So, and I was researching this, and I looked into, was he ever deconditioned by John Watson? Because you can actually decondition a phobia. No. John Watson didn't bother deconditioning him. Did any other experimental psychologist decondition him? No. This is 1920. There were no ethics for experimentation. People were experimenting. They were experimenting with the prison population, with people in insane asylums, and even hospitals, probably schools, the military. They were just experimenting whatever they could get away with. You've all heard of the infamous Tuskegee experimentations with black men who were infected with syphilis and then not treated. That went on for a long time, that infamous experiment. Then the other quote in the front of my book, in my galley anyway, is by IRA Wolfman, who's a character in my novel. So I just wrote that in my own hand. B.F. Skinner and Ira Wolfman. Ira Wolfman is also a behaviorist. He's a psychologist in the novel in the university that the girl is sent to for her exile and rehabilitation. He says, quote, "We're trapped in our own experiments." Ira Wolfman. Ira Wolfman to me was a wonderful character because he's also in exile in this place, this sort of zone 9 as it's called. There are people in exile, but they can't acknowledge one another. However, they're sort of aware that they might exist, but it would be death if you acknowledge that you were an exile because you're not supposed to tell. But Ira Wolfman and the girl kind of connect with one another, and they have a sort of romance or kind of love affair, not really a fully consummated affair. Ira Wolfman is an older man, and the girl is only 17 and then 18. But Ira Wolfman to me was a perfect character because he comes from the future. He knows all about Noam Chomsky and the challenge to behaviorism that Chomsky represented in the 1960s and the total revolution and evisceration of behaviorism in the 1960s. But in 1959, nobody else would know about that. So Ira Wolfman to me also seemed like a nice name. So the novel was published, and I got, one day I went to my computer, and there's this email from Ira Wolfman. I thought, oh no, he's connecting with me from the future, and I was just so afraid. And so I looked at it, and there's a real person named Ira Wolfman, and he read the novel, and he was wondering why I put him in the novel. And I hurriedly read through it to see, is he suing me? I didn't think he'd sue me because he's a very smart character in the novel. So we're all trapped in our own experiments as a consequence of this conditioning. I think I'll just open this up for any questions that somebody might possibly have. I can ask who believes in time travel. So I've made it very realistic here, how she's sent back in time. She's dematerialized and so sent back. How else could you do it? Does anybody believe in time travel? So a few people, Now, do you really believe in time travel, or is it a metaphor?
It's a metaphor.
You do, really? How would it work? You remember H.G. Wells' The Time Machine? There's actually a contraption of this, the time traveler sits on it, and it rattles, and the sun and moon kind of spin around very rapidly, and he finds himself in the future. Terrible places he goes to. Yes?
I'd like to say one thing and then ask a question.
Here's your microphone.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Forgot. Okay, first a quick comment. One of the things that I always think of when I hear the phrase time travel is that all of us are time traveling every second of our lives.
That's true.
That in fact, in some ways, that's the most important kind of traveling we do.
Yes.
And so the specialized kind of time travel you're talking about, in which we switch times and whatnot, is, I think that's an important literary trope, because we all have a sense as we go through our lives that we're time traveling all the time. My question is, it sounds to me as if essentially this novel is about thought crimes. And I wondered if you had, in the last couple of years in this country, as things have darkened politically and socially, if you've considered the idea that whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, people are now accusing one another of thought crimes all the time.
All the time, yes. I think that the history caught up with me, because I really finished the novel before even the campaign of 2016. It was such acrimonious campaign, and so much fake news. I mean, deliberately faked news to manipulate people and to suppress voting and so forth. And rather than uniting the country, which is many politicians try really hard to unite the country, that's deliberate division and kind of assault upon the sense of a unified country, turning people against one another. So it all caught up with me. Of course, what I did, little revisions of the novel and kind of brought it up to date. But I had already anticipated that there would be parklands, like national parks, that were just sort of let go and given out to private capitalists to develop. And libraries not given any money, so that they sort of shut down, just sort of withdrawing the budget from certain areas of scientific research. And I sort of thought that might come along with the totalitarian state, because the scientific attitude is one of skepticism and questioning and wanting evidence. And so that's the one thing totalitarian government doesn't want anybody to be scientific. Yes, you're quite right about the time travel. However, I think that we have a predilection to naturally believe in time travel, because when we sleep at night, when we fall asleep, we are catapulted often into the past, into some zone that's really not the present. And we are not necessarily ourselves as we are now. We might be younger. People enter that world with us who may have been maybe dead, but there's a contemporary. Everything's sort of contemporary. It's like ahistorical, even though it may have taken place. You're dreaming about when you were 5 years old. It's somehow contemporary. And people are different ages, and some people are no longer living, but they're right there. And I think often in our dreams, a person no longer living doesn't seem to know it. But I've noticed if I dream about people no longer living, they don't say anything. They're usually kind of quiet. I'd love to do research and find out if other people share that. Like, I think also, and I put this in the novel, I think also when we're dreaming, and I was just talking to somebody at UC Berkeley, actually, who's in computer science and neuroscience, and he said this is true, that we don't have the fine detail in our dreams that we have with our eyes right now. Because our brains fill in, evidently we don't really see the things we think we see. He was explaining that. He said the brain kind of fills in a lot of gaps, you know? And I was saying, well, if I go over and touch the wall, it will have that same texture. He didn't answer that. He didn't answer. He said, oh, your brain is putting a lot of, it's closing gaps for you that you don't know about. The blind spot, you don't know you have a blind spot, but you don't know about it. Whereas in a dream, this wouldn't be here because it's too special. You know, the lettering, you wouldn't probably see that. There wouldn't be the ornate kind of ceiling and all the detail like the Venetian blinds. You wouldn't have that in a dream. Like the idea of a window, sort of, maybe no window. There wouldn't even be a wall. It would just be sort of a place, you know, you have a sense. But that's how we know that we're awake right now. that kind of detail. And also, if you're giving a book, if you have a book in a dream, usually you can't read anything because that is it's so small for the eye that I very often see things in dreams, but I can't read them. And if I'm working on trying to write something, I can't read what I'm writing. So in a crucial scene in this novel, the girl pulls down a book from a shelf she's not supposed to be looking at, actually. And she tries to read it, and it really, she can't quite figure out what it is. But I had a lot of fun writing about Wainscotia, Wisconsin, because I made it the place where people were very avid and eager and dedicated and intelligent, working on their experiments in science and in physics and writing their poetry and doing their literary criticism and their geology, all these things that they were doing, every one of them mistaken. Every one of them. The astrophysicists thought that the universe was a steady state universe. In the 1950s, there were reasons, cultural reasons for wanting things that were steady and not expanding. But if you were an astrophysicist of that time or a young person, a postdoc, writing a dissertation, you might have been very eagerly working on something. Though you were brilliant, you're all wrong. It's going to be refuted in the next decade. And the most interesting thing of behaviorism, as I said, is totally eviscerated just in a few years later by the young Noam Chomsky, who's just maybe about 25 years old. He sort of comes swaggering along. He totally eviscerates behaviorism with like a 60-page review of B.F. Skinner's new book. My husband, Charlie Gross, who's not that old actually, my husband, Charlie Gross, was a freshman at Harvard, and he was actually in the laboratory of B.F. Skinner. So Charlie himself represents a sort of transition. He was a Skinnerian, as everybody was at Harvard, and most people were Skinnerians. Freud's not a scientist. He's not really considered a scientist, but Skinner was the great psychologist. So Charlie was in that lab, and he was a Skinnerian, and he was doing the classic experiments, every kind of variation on how to condition rats, pigeons, and then people, because the idea is to condition people. You can get people to vote by scaring them. You get people to vote by making them envious. You establish allegiances with other people. You get them to vote for those people, even though what you're doing is totally against your own self-interest. You can be manipulated brilliantly by somebody who knows how to do it. We see that being done now. John Watson was the first person to really draw up specific ideas for advertising. How do you make somebody buy a really expensive and sort of meaningless, conspicuously extravagant automobile? Who doesn't need that fancy automobile? Well, you evoke in him, and I say him, you invoke in him feelings of sexual jealousy and something to do with being a man and a kind of swaggering, like a peacock or a rooster. You sort of, you touch upon the insecurity of most people, and you suggest with the advertising, with this consumption, how they can remedy their feelings of insecurity. If it's a female, you might show a really beautiful, extremely beautiful woman, and she's got Colgate toothpaste or something, and she's so beautiful because she's brushed her teeth with. And then making people feel really worried about, do they smell right? So there are deodorants for that. And do people really need to smoke so much? Well, here's a doctor in a white coat. He's smoking cigarettes, and he says they're perfectly safe, and he loves his cigarettes. So this is sort of one of the great sciences of America is advertising. And when you look at it, it's always based upon arousing anxiety, insecurity, envy, or whatever in human beings to get them to part with their money. So when I was in that world, I sort of looked around and thought that world of the 1950s is a world that is antithetical in so many ways to our world right now, the way girls and women were treated. Just the atmosphere of a room like this would be blue with smoke, everybody smoked. People smoked on airplanes. They smoked in hospitals, including the patients in the beds. They were smoking in the beds with little ashtrays like right next to their beds. Some of us who lived through that era don't really remember how weird it was. But as a time traveler going back, you think that even though you lived through it, it's totally bizarre, and you wonder how you survived. Is there any maybe final question? Yes, sir.
The technologies of this millennium, including the social media and now the advent of artificial information, seem to have introduced into our public culture and our public conversation a degree of incivility and the possibilities of social control that we could not have imagined 20 years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
Is there any walking backward from that, or is technology always a generation or two ahead of the social response to that? Thank you.
Well, that's very interesting. There's a new professor at UC Berkeley, and I'm not going to try to say his name because I probably don't remember it or can't pronounce it. So he is the father of forensic computer science. He's the person who's developed the science where you look at a video or a photograph and you can figure out that it's fake, but nobody else can tell. They're done so brilliant and seamlessly now. You can see photographs and videos of people doing things who never did those things, saying things they never said. So the forensics experts in computer science are like detectives who will have to decode that. He said that the upcoming 2020 election is going to have faked news and virtual reality like the world's never seen before. And that's going to be an avalanche and a flood, and he thinks it's really awful. He stood in front of this audience. He said the internet is a tragedy, that we should just get rid of it. I mean, he's sort of joking. At the same time, it's sort of beyond any ability for individuals to deal with. It used to be that there was some sort of center of something. Now there is a kind of egalitarianism of a kind, like a parody of democracy where everyone's got his own opinion. Well, I don't want to end on a negative note. But I just wanted to say that the novel takes the girl. She becomes sort of a young woman at the end of the novel, and she learns to adjust to that world. And I'm not saying that this is something that we have to, take to heart. There's something to be said for trying your very best, but if you can't really do it, to learn to live, to make a connection with one or two or three other human beings. The great society may be beyond your ability to do much about, but you can always make a genuine connection with another human being, and I sort of put my trust in that, like Auden saying, take short views. So thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. It's a pleasure to have you here, and please come up, buy a book, read, and have your book signed, and join us for our upcoming programs. Thank you for being here.